Remember this sound. Sharp, piercing, brooking no objections. The school bell. From the earliest childhood, it becomes an integral part of our daily reality, dividing life into strict segments of permitted activity and mandatory, unquestioning submission. We are accustomed to considering it a harmless attribute of acquiring knowledge, a symbol of the start of a new, exciting lesson, or a long-awaited saving break. But the deeper I dug, studying the hidden mechanisms of social construction, the more terrifying the picture unfolding before me became. This sound has never had absolutely anything in common with true enlightenment or personal development. The school bell is a trigger of obedience, a crude tool of acoustic control, which was coldly copied from the grim textile factories and correctional prisons of the late 19th century. The sharp signal means that you must immediately stop thinking independently, take your pre-assigned place in the line, and prepare to carry out others' commands. It is with this monotonous sound that the daily, multi-year training begins, methodically shaping the ideal, submissive performer. Think for a second and answer yourself one extremely uncomfortable question. At what exact moment in our history did we, as a rational society, decide that handing over our own children for the long 12 years to closed, strictly regulated institutions is absolutely normal and natural? At what moment did we voluntarily agree that a growing, living, and curious mind should be forcibly placed in an artificial environment, isolated from the real world, where every step, every movement, breath, and exhale is rigidly controlled by an invisible system of rules and schedules? With astonishing readiness, we hand over the most valuable thing we have into the cold hands of a faceless, bureaucratic machine, naively believing that there they will make free, happy, and all-round developed people out of our children. But true freedom is the last thing that interests the shadowy architects of this global matrix. From the very first day in this closed space, the child's personal autonomy is methodically, step by step, mercilessly taken away. Starting from a deep, traumatic feeling of lost freedom, the system begins to rewrite the basic code of human personality, replacing the innate drive for knowledge with constant fear of punishment and painful dependence on external approval and standardized assessments. If you look with utmost attention at the internal structure of modern mass education, you will see not a bright temple of science, but a cold, impeccably calculated blueprint of a large industrial enterprise. The school bell, the artificial division of students into isolated classes strictly by year of graduation, and the fragmentation of the unified, complex picture of the world into subjects, torn apart from each other, each lasting exactly 45 minutes. This is not advanced pedagogy at all. These are classic, rigid, and uncompromising methods of industrial management. They were not created to uncover hidden talents, stimulate imagination, or raise future independent thinkers and geniuses. They were meticulously developed by engineers and powerful industrial magnates for one single pragmatic purpose: the mass training of future workers on an endless conveyor belt. A person who, from an early age, is accustomed to having their intellectual activity crudely interrupted by a sharp bell every 45 minutes, forever loses the ability for deep, continuous, and meaningful immersion in one complex task. Their attention becomes artificially fragmented, clip-like, and superficial. They get used to the fact that the meaning and rhythm of their work are determined not by themselves, but by an external schedule, ruthlessly imposed from above by invisible management. The division into classes by age is another frightening and dehumanizing element of this cold industrial conveyor. People are sorted exactly the same way as soulless machines sort raw materials or standard parts on a giant factory, exclusively by date of production. No one in this system truly cares about the individual pace of intellectual development, unique creative inclinations, or the level of emotional maturity of a specific child. There exists only a standard batch of goods that must go through the same stages of conveyor processing in the same strictly set time frame. If a part suddenly does not meet the preset parameters or starts asking too many questions, it is immediately marked as defective and subjected to the most powerful psychological pressure from the quality controllers, teachers, and school administration. This total system of standardization cynically kills the very essence of human individuality. The deeper I analyzed these mechanisms of social control, the clearer it became. What we have before us is not the result of random pedagogical errors, but a mathematically precise, ideal tool of suppression. We were deceived into devoutly believing that true knowledge can be acquired only in strictly measured portions, exclusively at the loud bell, meekly sitting in even rows behind absolutely identical desks. This entire oppressive architecture of physical space was originally created solely for the methodical suppression of free will. We have long grown accustomed to looking at the modern school and seeing in it society's sincere concern for the bright future of new generations. But as soon as we tear away the heavy veil of imposed illusions for a moment, a gigantic, soulless mechanism for the uninterrupted production of convenient cogs for the endless system appears before us in all its frightening, blood-chilling grandeur, in which from our very first breath we are preordained only the sad role of unquestioning service personnel. Let's mentally return to that historical era that preceded the modern period of total standardization. The world before the advent of compulsory mass schools was radically different from our current suffocating reality. It was a world of genuine personal autonomy and natural transmission of vital skills. For long centuries, people learned crafts, arts, and sciences through direct mentorship and daily practical experience. Knowledge was organically passed from the experienced master to the apprentice in a living, unbroken dialogue. No one could even conceive of forcibly locking growing children into stuffy classroom boxes for the monotonous memorization of completely abstract theories, entirely detached from their future real-world application. A person grew up as an independent creator of their own destiny, capable of thinking independently, critically assessing what was happening around them, and taking full responsibility for the results of their hard labor. Families functioned as strong, self-sufficient economic units, where older generations passed to the younger not just dry facts, but a holistic worldview. It was precisely this innate self-reliance, unbroken connection with reality, and independence of thought that posed a colossal threat to those hidden elites who were already then hatching grand plans for the centralization of global control over the minds of humanity. The deeper I dug, carefully studying the dusty historical chronicles, the clearer it became that the free individual was the main obstacle for the emerging bureaucratic and military machine. The system urgently needed a radical historical shift, a massive social experiment that would forever break the will to resist in millions of people. And this tectonic shift ultimately occurred. The historical bomb that forever destroyed the classical model of free education exploded in Europe at the very beginning of the 19th century. Any totalitarian control always skillfully masquerades as the noble salvation of the nation in a moment of deep crisis. In 1806, the excellently armed Prussian army suffered a crushing and incredibly humiliating defeat from the advancing troops of Napoleon Bonaparte in the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussian elites were in a state of absolute paralyzing panic. Analyzing in detail the causes of this catastrophic military failure, they arrived at a shocking but extremely pragmatic conclusion. The problem lay not at all in the lack of modern weapons or outdated tactics. The problem was deeply rooted in the psychology of people. Prussian soldiers still possessed dangerous remnants of individualism. They thought about themselves, about their families left behind. They could doubt the expediency of a senseless, deadly order on the battlefield. The individual ego became the main enemy of the state. And it was precisely then that the influential philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte stepped onto the historical stage. In his famous Addresses to the German Nation, he clearly formulated a concept monstrous in its cold cynicism, which became the foundation of a completely new educational paradigm. Fichte openly stated that the state must completely seize the malleable mind of the child before it learns to reason independently. He proposed creating a closed system that would artificially shape the person so that they simply physically could not desire anything other than what the higher leadership unconditionally orders. Thus was born the famous Prussian education system, about which official pedagogy textbooks today persistently remain silent. Its true, meticulously documented goal was not at all the spiritual enlightenment of the masses, or the revelation of each child's unique, innate talents. The goal was extremely utilitarian, cruel, and frightening. The mass conveyor belt production of perfectly obedient soldiers for the expanding army and absolutely submissive, unquestioning citizens for the state. The elites needed people who would never, under any circumstances, dare to ask unnecessary questions of their superiors, or doubt for even a second the legitimacy of the orders received. For the first time in human history, the ordinary school turned into a ruthless tool of deep psychological programming on a state scale. From the earliest years, children were deliberately instilled with barracks discipline, absolute reverence for any official authority, and a slavish habit of mindless submission to a rigid external schedule. It was here that those very bells and standardized exams were finally entrenched, which methodically broke individual will and accustomed the child to the idea that their basic human value is determined exclusively by the degree of their blind obedience to the system. The philosopher Fichte and his devoted followers brilliantly accomplished the task. They created an ideal incubator for growing obedient bio-robots, ready at the first demand to go to certain death or monotonously toil for the enrichment of the ruling class, without even trying to think about the reasons for their slavish condition. But the most terrifying and incomprehensible thing in this investigation is not the Prussian model of control itself, but the frightening synchronicity with which this mental virus of voluntary submission rapidly infected the entire planet. Literally within a few short decades, this authoritarian, personality-suppressing matrix, as if following a perfectly compiled instruction manual, was meticulously copied and universally implemented around the world. The largest industrial magnates, influential bureaucrats, and hidden global elites from various countries, watching with undisguised admiration the fail-safe efficiency of the Prussian obedience conveyor, quickly realized that they had in their hands the ideal weapon of absolute domination. They no longer needed to brutally suppress worker uprisings with armed force. Now it was enough simply to reprogram the next generation at the early childhood stage. Classical education, for centuries based on the deep study of formal logic, rhetoric, classical philosophy, and the liberal arts, was ruthlessly destroyed and replaced with this cheap surrogate mechanism of training. The invisible rulers of the new industrial world understood one simple truth. Why spend huge resources teaching the masses to think when you can much more cheaply teach them to obey unquestioningly? This global expansion happened very quietly, reliably hiding behind plausible pretexts of universal literacy and social progress. To the gullible society, they masterfully sold the beautiful illusion of equal opportunities, while behind tightly closed doors, an indestructible infrastructure of mental slavery was being built.
We have forever lost the world of independent creators,
Receiving in exchange a suffocating, grey reality of identical, standardized cogs, which are brutally trained for years in classroom cells so that they can uninterruptedly serve the financial interests of those who write their lying textbooks. Every nation, every state gladly adopted this sinister blueprint because no power has ever been or will be interested in free people, capable of asking uncomfortable questions of the system. Any totalitarian control system, no matter how sophisticated and philosophically justified it may seem at first glance, always has under it an absolutely concrete, rigid, and cynical financial foundation. Studying the transformation of world education, I constantly ask myself the same question. Who exactly benefited so much from turning millions of unique, living people into a faceless, standardized resource? What was the hidden mechanism of monetization of this grand social experiment?
The deeper I dug, the more terrifying the picture became that opened behind the facade of official charity.
If the Prussian model was originally built to meet the needs of the military machine and bureaucratic apparatus, then at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, completely new, much more powerful forces entered the game. Onto the historical stage came the titans of the industrial era, industrial and financial magnates for whom the entire globe was merely a giant sales market and an endless source of cheap labor. These people categorically did not need independent farmers, proud craftsmen, or free-thinking intellectuals capable of defending their civil rights. They needed a gigantic, submissive army of hired workers for their endless factories, plants, and corporations. They needed people who would meekly stand at the conveyor belt for 10 or 12 hours a day, performing monotonous operations, and at the same time, never ponder the glaring injustice of the existing economic world order. The school was to become that very impenetrable filter that would forever cut off any possibility of independent, critical perception of the surrounding reality. When big capital needs to radically restructure society to fit its narrow, selfish needs, it always skillfully masks its destructive actions as sincere care for future generations. The ideal and most large-scale illustration of this cynical corporate order was the General Education Board, which was officially created by one of the most influential and richest people in world history, the oil magnate John D. Rockefeller in the United States of America in 1902. The official press of that time was literally bursting with puppy-like enthusiasm, vying to describe the unprecedented generosity of the great philanthropist, allocating astronomical sums for the widespread development of schools and support of universal education. But let's set aside this beautiful, glossy, propagandistic wrapper and carefully look at the real historical documents that were originally not intended for the general public at all. Why did a ruthless monopolist, who built his colossal empire on the merciless suppression of any competitors and the harshest exploitation of ordinary workers, suddenly need to invest millions in educating other people's children? The true answer lies in the very pragmatic nature of industrial production. Corporations at that time catastrophically lacked standardized human material. They urgently needed a reliable, uninterrupted conveyor system that from early childhood would select, sort, and format the brains of future employees, methodically instilling in them the necessary psychological patterns: absolute punctuality, blind obedience, complete absence of unnecessary personal ambitions, and a steadfast habit of meekly carrying out any instructions from superiors without the slightest questions. The mass school came to be perceived by industrialists not as a bright place of enlightenment, but as the very first, basic workshop of a huge corporate factory, where shadowy elites literally ordered for themselves submissive service personnel with preset and strictly calibrated technical specifications. To finally dispel any naive illusions regarding the true, hidden motives of these great philanthropists, it suffices for us to turn to the dry, archival records.
In the annals of history,
There exists one astonishing document, whose careful reading still sends shivers down the spine. This is an official manifesto written by Frederick Gates, Rockefeller's chief advisor and the key ideological architect of this entire new global educational system. In the official document of 1913, he formulates with utmost frankness, without the slightest embarrassment or false modesty, the general long-term goal of all their colossal activities. His words sound not like pedagogical guidance, but like a cruel verdict on all humanity. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. We shall not try to make these people philosophers, scholars, or independent creators. Ponder the chilling, paralyzing horror of these lines. This is not a paranoid conspiracy theory, not the wild speculations of fringe online researchers. This is a direct, clearly documented declaration of intent from a narrow group of individuals who at that historical moment effectively owned half the globe and had at their disposal virtually unlimited financial resources to bring their monstrous plans to life. They openly admit that their main, cherished dream is the ideal, absolute submission of the masses. They straightforwardly declare to the world that they are deliberately depriving a huge portion of humanity of the basic right to high intellectual and free creative development. The architects of this new matrix understood absolutely clearly and plainly. If you properly teach a common person philosophy, they will inevitably start asking dangerous questions about the meaning of life and the justice of laws. If you make them a true, inquisitive scholar, they will surely begin to dig into the hidden essence of things. If you raise them as an independent, self-reliant creator, they will never in their life agree to voluntarily become an obedient, faceless cog in their gigantic corporate machine. That is why any critical thinking was deemed by them not just superfluous, but mortally dangerous. A destructive element that needed to be methodically and ruthlessly eradicated as early as the stage of elementary school. Thus, before our very eyes, the final, quiet takeover of the education system by the global corporate sector occurred. Curricula were completely rewritten and rigidly standardized in such a way as to give children only extremely fragmented, disjointed knowledge. They were taught to read just enough to correctly understand a written instruction from their boss, or read a bright advertising brochure. They were taught to count just enough to calculate the interest on their bank loan, or figure out the cost of goods at the store checkout. But they were never again taught to see the world picture as a whole, deeply understand hidden economic processes, or clearly realize their own human rights. The school finally and irrevocably turned into a gigantic factory for the continuous production of ideal, will-less consumers. For a person artificially deprived of inner spiritual support, unable to think independently and critically evaluate incoming information, becomes an incredibly easy prey for cynical marketers and calculating bankers. From early childhood, they accustom him to the idea that his personal value is measured exclusively by external attributes. First, it's just good grades in the school diary, then prestigious clothing brands, expensive cars, and status housing bought on credit. As a result of this long experiment, we got entire generations of people who annually emerge from school walls with absolutely empty souls and a deeply programmed sense of their own inadequacy, which they desperately try to fill with endless, meaningless consumption of material goods. The elites, brilliantly, note perfectly, implemented their devilish plan. They created an ideal closed cycle of monetization, where a person first submissively and laboriously works for their corporations, producing the necessary goods, and then obediently gives all the earned money back to the same corporations, buying those very goods to at least somehow meet the artificially imposed standards of social success. And the most important thing in this scheme is that such a standardized, system-broken person inevitably becomes an eternal, absolutely submissive debtor. The global system of lending, endless mortgages, and quick loans becomes the absolutely logical, natural continuation of years of school training. A graduate, completely unable to create their own life meanings and independent sources of income, is forever doomed to sell their personal time for peanuts throughout their entire life, constantly living in paralyzing fear of dismissal. This massive corporate order is successfully being fulfilled even today, skillfully masquerading as modern education standards, while the hidden masters of the world continue to greedily reap the fruits of our slavery. The transition from absolutely free, unpredictable human life to strictly regulated, algorithmic existence simply could not have occurred without the final, most powerful and sophisticated tool of mental suppression. The shadowy architects of this gigantic global matrix urgently needed a universal, fail-safe mechanism that would finally, with a deafening clang, close the steel bars of the invisible cage around the consciousness of every maturing child. And they brilliantly found this cruel mechanism, masterfully implementing it worldwide under the hypocritical guise of objective assessment of acquired knowledge. I am talking about the system of standardized testing. The deeper I dug, scrupulously studying the destructive impact of these endless exams on the human brain, the more terrifying and hopeless the picture unfolding before me became. We, naively, out of inertial habit, have grown accustomed to considering school tests a completely harmless way to check learned material. But in harsh reality, this is a ruthless, conveyor belt process of surgically severing any non-standard thoughts. The testing system from early years accustoms the growing, malleable mind to one single, extremely destructive axiom. In this world, there always exists only one pre-approved, correct answer. This answer has long been known to higher management, and your sole humiliating task is simply to guess it, obediently checking the box in the appropriate cell of the faceless form. Any alternative solutions, any independent creative search, any bright manifestation of true innate genius is now harshly punished with immediate point deduction and public social humiliation. It is precisely this way that the natural human curiosity is finally killed off. And this sinister pattern repeats across the entire globe, daily turning millions of unique, living minds into gray, absolutely predictable biomass, always ready to unquestioningly obey any algorithms handed down from above. To fully grasp, to the point of trembling hands, the entire soul-chilling scale of this artificially created intellectual catastrophe, we need to set aside emotions and turn to absolutely real, dry scientific facts that the system prefers to hide extremely carefully from the general public. The historical culmination of this entire investigation lies in one little-known but utterly unprecedented study conducted at the time by the outstanding scientist George Land. Once, he received a truly unique and incredibly complex government contract from such a powerful and secretive organization as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. To effectively solve the most complex, unprecedented engineering challenges, this advanced space agency urgently needed people with a deep, innovative approach. In response to this request, Land developed a special, thoroughly elaborated test for divergent thinking. That is, the ability of the human brain to instantly find a huge multitude of non-standard solutions for a single problem. This brilliant tool worked excellently on adult engineers, but then the scientist made a fateful decision. He decided to apply the exact same test to the most ordinary children, in order to forever understand where our creative potential truly comes from. The results he obtained in the course of this large-scale experiment still amaze the imagination and make the blood freeze in the veins of every thinking person. When the researchers tested young children at the age of 5, a shocking circumstance emerged. An incredible 98% of all the little subjects proved to be absolute geniuses of creativity. Just think about this figure.
Nearly every person on our planet is born with completely boundless creative potential, capable of overturning and transforming this established world. But then, these happy, free children went to ordinary compulsory school. And when the scientists tested the very same children after 10 years of school, after the industrial education system ruthlessly ran them through its standardized grinders, the result was only 30%. School, like a toxic acid, methodically burned out of them the unique ability to think non-standardly. But this is far from the end of this frightening, depressing statistic. When the same divergent thinking test was taken by adults over 25 years old, who had already fully and irreversibly integrated into the system and gone through all the mandatory stages of conveyor belt education, the genius rate plummeted to a miserable 2%. School literally, on a physiological level, destroyed the innate creators in them, deliberately erasing their individual potential into dust. This catastrophic percentage collapse is not a tragic accident, not a side effect of poor teaching, and certainly not a mistake by incompetent teachers. This is the main, originally conceived, and mathematically precise goal of that very soulless conveyor of standards that we analyzed in such detail earlier. The hidden elites, transnational industrial magnates, and ironclad state bureaucracy simply cannot physically manage a world that consists of 98% free geniuses and independent, critically thinking intellectuals. True geniuses cannot be commanded in an orderly fashion. They cannot be forced to perform meaningless, monotonous work on stuffy factories for long decades, and they cannot be imposed with blind, mindless consumption of completely unnecessary goods through cheap advertising. A true genius always poses extremely uncomfortable questions to the system, always breaks artificially constructed frameworks, and always continuously strives for absolute inner freedom. But managing those very 2% of miraculously surviving broken talents who are reliably surrounded on all sides by an endless gray ocean of absolutely obedient executors, devoid of the divine spark. This is the most ideal, flawless scenario for maintaining total global power. This is the foundation of uninterrupted, eternal enrichment for the narrow ruling class. And it is precisely here that another sinister, everyday element of school architecture comes to the forefront, which finally and irrevocably slams the steel cage around the immature human mind. This is the implemented system of constant, daily grades. We have long and deeply grown accustomed to naively believing that school marks simply objectively reflect the level of our real knowledge. But in harsh reality, school grades are the earliest, most cruel, and uncompromising training for integrating every person into the future global system of social rating and total financial control. Every time a child receives a grade for their answer at the blackboard, on a deep, unconscious level, they assimilate the most fundamental lesson of voluntary slavery.
Your personal human value no longer belongs to you yourself. It is always unconditionally determined by some external, faceless, but endowed with unquestionable authority figure. The school grade is not at all a measure of your inquisitive mind. It is exclusively a mathematical measure of your loyalty to the established system. You are strictly evaluated not for your thoughts, but for how quietly and meekly you sit at your standard desk, how precisely, word for word, you repeat others' memorized phrases from the approved textbook, and how submissively you adhere to meaningless, unsubstantiated rules of discipline. This is simply the ideal, decades-tested psychological preparation for the upcoming adult life under the harsh conditions of constant financial pressure. The ordinary school diary, with its strict red grades, smoothly, absolutely imperceptibly flows into the adult's electronic credit history. Exactly as in elementary school, the little frightened student panics at the fear of getting a bad mark and losing the teacher's favorable approval, so in adult life, they will fear to the point of trembling knees, spoiling their perfect bank rating, or receiving social censure from the all-seeing oversight organs. The industrial system cynically accustoms us from the tenderest age to constantly look back at the invisible overseer and desperately, with all their might, earn their passing scores. The closing of the mental cage happens absolutely soundlessly. The little child, in whom the standard school so brilliantly and successfully killed any divergent thinking, inevitably grows into an adult who is even physically incapable of conceiving that one can live differently. They absolutely voluntarily, without the slightest resistance, accept others' cruel rules of the game, where their behavior, their daily spending, and their social connections are constantly evaluated by the global corporate algorithm. School is not a temple of science. It is a multi-year, exhausting process of calibrating human sensors, after which each of us perfectly, like a standard part, fits into a pre-prepared slot in the gigantic database.